Hi guys, my name is DeForest Garcia, and I'm doing my presentation over um, hosting mega sporting events and issues of poverty and urban development and stuff like that. In this day and age, sports are one of the most popular things in the world, and the World Cup, the Olympics, you see countries all the time trying to host these events, And the USA, you see them trying to host the World Cup. You see Brazil went all out to get the Olympics and the World Cup back to back. But the bigger thing in all of this is, how's this benefiting the country? How's this benefiting the host cities? You see and you hear about billions of dollars getting spent on facilities and infrastructure, but what are the long-term benefits of hosting a mega sporting event? And that's kind of something that I'm going to look at in this presentation is, what are the benefits? Well, first, as I just mentioned, there's millions and billions spent on hosting these events. And you can do so much good with millions and billions of dollars. You can spend it on, improving housing, improving, sewer lines, electricity, stuff like that. But it never seems to get done. He said a lot of it's just spent on fancy facilities and, things that aren't going to be so long term. I say my main point, most recently at the FIFA World Cup in Brazil, said you probably heard, about riots and stuff going on down there, very controversial. The Brazilian government was spending money on fancy hotels, billion-dollar stadiums around in these host cities, and they're being built around poverty-stricken neighborhoods. And in the beginning, they had promised to clean up these ghettos, clean up these neighborhoods, and great. I'm all for it. But this is a country that's 11% of them live in poverty, on less than $2 a day at that. So that's just an unacceptable number, and hosting a mega event like the World Cup and the Olympics, that could be huge. Billions of dollars are coming in for these events. That could be huge in terms of creating jobs, in terms of, cleaning up neighborhoods, building new apartments, anything, low-income housing, anything to help these people. So the Brazilian government said they were going to clean up the streets, but they did it in a different way. They cluttered the ghettos together. They took all these people and shoved them into the ghettos. They didn't take them and make them a part of the World Cup festival. They made all these fancy beaches and all these other things and distracted fans who were coming in to go to the beaches rather than walk around the streets. So they spent their money on these huge stadiums, and even their roadways and airports that they promised infrastructure improvements on, they got delayed. They ran into the World Cup. It actually caused flight delays, things like that. So they just caused all sorts of problems. Said, and my point in this kind of brief introduction is the worst case scenario after building all these flashy, expensive facilities that, you're wasting your money on, is them not being used after the competition is over. I say this is a problem, specifically, it was a problem in South Africa at the 2010 World Cup, and I'll kind of touch on that later. And it was also a problem, big problem, at the Athens Olympics in 2004. So they spent $7 billion on an athletic complex to build brand new facilities, all these fancy stadiums for softball, baseball, things that aren't likely going to be played in Greece after the sport is over. I mean, they have no prominence on a national stage in field hockey, beach volleyball, things like that. They don't have a prominence in that. So instead of, building facilities that, can be reusable in the long-term facility by, local citizens, or, collapsible venues like they did in the London Games, they elected to build a permanent sports facility, which now is sitting in ruins, basically. You can look up pictures on the internet. It's literally in ruins. It hasn't been touched. And, a major lesson that can be learned from the Athens Olympics is, it needs to be, long-term benefits need to be considered. When you're building things, it needs to be either a short-term facility taken down and moved on, or it's going to stay for the long term, but it's going to be used in the long term. So, anyways, in this presentation, I'm just going to kind of address, the topic of poverty and hosting these major sporting events, and where the government's spending their money, what they're spending it on, and how the local communities are being ignored. And the research question that I wanted to answer was, what can be done to adequately host these sporting events while also providing an opportunity to fight poverty and, increase the standard of living for these people. So the two disciplines that I explored in this presentation, or in my research paper, were economics and political science. And, specifically, how can you combine these two to create a solution for the problem? Well, from an economic standpoint, obviously, you need to spend the money in the right places. And from the political science view, you need to have the right people making the right decisions. So, a source that I kind of wanted to talk about from the economic discipline is the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa, that I briefly mentioned earlier. The economic impact that it had on South Africa was, they didn't see it. There's long-term costs that are associated with hosting these events, and sometimes they have serious consequences if it's not done correctly. And South Africa was one of those countries that didn't really make any money out of it. They didn't have long-term benefits out of it. A specific example, they spent $6 billion on infrastructure, the entire games basically. A major chunk of that was on stadiums and facilities. I believe the number was about maybe a quarter of it was spent on facilities alone. So they built this $137 million stadium in a city named Nelspruit, which is not really in a major city. It's kind of far from Johannesburg. It's kind of far from Cape Town. It's not a big major city. And they built this huge $137 million stadium right next to a poverty-stricken neighborhood. You could literally, there's pictures of it, literally this neighborhood that's surrounding the stadium, that's just shacks, shanties, no electricity, no water. So now that the World Cup's moved on, the top flight soccer league in South Africa does not have a team in Nelspruit. So it's empty. It's literally going to be empty. It said they get cricket and rugby games, sometimes soccer games in there, but it's sitting empty. That was $137 million that could have been devoted to improving the surrounding area. Why not cut out $37 million of that? Why not cut out half of that, spend it on sidewalks, roads, parks, water, electricity, sewage, and improving housing in the area? Half of that money could have still built a wonderful stadium, not quite as big or flashy, but it also could have helped the neighborhood around it, and it could have made a long-term benefit rather than short-term for the World Cup, and you get nothing in the long term. Another example I wanted to use on facilities was just 2002 World Cup in Japan and South Korea. They co-hosted it. They spent, I believe $280 million. They actually lost $280 million co-hosting the World Cup. But at the same time, they went on and built flashy facilities. Now in Japan, it made a little more sense because they have a soccer league that's rather popular. They have a baseball league that's rather popular. And the average attendance of the J League, which is the soccer league in Japan, is about 20,000. So that's okay. However, one of the sources that I looked at said that half of the budget towards the 2002 World Cup was put towards stadiums, which is money that can be used elsewhere towards urban development. They said the authors from that article concluded that general improvement in the quality of life of the Japanese population, it was still far from being accomplished after the World Cup. Said a mega event has its commercial benefits, but in order to benefit the quality of life and fight things such as poverty and improve infrastructure, better decisions need to be made in terms of an economic strategy. He said, like I said with South Africa, they spent so much money on facilities. Japan did the same thing. Even though they had more usability, it's still money that could be used to fight poverty and improve the quality of life for the citizens. So, a third article that I found, and this is kind of the last thing I'm going to touch on with economics, but the Beijing Games, they were kind of the first games to look at what they can do to make the Olympics benefit the local economy, what they can do to benefit the city in the long term. Well, they did things such as they built a convention center to host Olympic events such as, I believe there was archery, wrestling, boxing, stuff like that. They had built a convention center that would host those events, but after the games were over, they could host conventions, concerts, things like that. And they're revenue-generating projects that are benefiting the city in the long term. Said, I think they were one of the first ones to look at the Olympic Village, which is a major expense because there needs to be a lot of rooms for these athletes. They were the first ones to look at converting the Olympic Village into low-income housing after the Games. And the 2012 Olympics in London, they were actually the first to do it. They had their Olympic Village converted into apartments that were made available for rent after the Games were over. And also, in terms of the usability of facilities, the London Games also, the Olympic Stadium, it was built, but it didn't just sit empty. They said it was purchased by an English Premier League soccer club, and it's being converted to be their host stadium, so it's going to continue generating revenue. And, the point that I want to make there is, Athens showed it to us, Beijing recognized it. The more usability that a facility can have after the games are over, that's better for the long-term benefit of the host country. It's better in the long run. In terms of political science, I just found an article on using sport development to improve a city. And it's been done here in the United States several times. I said the article, or the example that I like to use is Indianapolis. They spent millions of dollars on what they can do to improve their city through sport. And now Indianapolis is one of a sports hub. They got the Colts, they got the Pacers. Said they've got some very successful sports teams there. He said they geared their spending in the city towards stimulating the local economy through sport. And even smaller towns have done it. Like in Oklahoma City, they have an area named Bricktown. This is a place that was spearheaded with an 18,000-seat arena and a 14,000-seat ballpark. And professional baseball, or minor league baseball, professional basketball, the Oklahoma City Thunder came, and the facilities led to this Bricktown area developing hotels, restaurants, shops, and it created a local economic boost. And this is something that Olympic and World Cup cities need to look at doing, is modeling their infrastructure and facilities towards an urban development. Making long-term benefits such as shops, restaurants, things that are going to stimulate the economy after the games are over. I kind of want to move into my conclusion here. And And what can be done to kind of fix these things? What can be done to improve the decision making? What can be done to fight poverty and improve the quality of life for people? Well, I've always been a believer in using sport for change, and the countries that host these mega events have a huge opportunity to use the World Cup and the Olympic Games as sport for change. So my solution is to create a new budget process, which means budgeting for improvements in poverty-stricken areas and also having the right people making the decisions. So in my solution, I want to cut out politicians and government making the decisions for these events. So I would rather have a non-biased, diverse committee or a third-party firm or something come in and make the decisions for the games, or for hosting these games. And before these games happen, I believe that a budgeting guideline should be established by the host entity. So if the FIFA World Cup's coming in, if the Olympic Games are coming in, they need to establish a budget on what they need to follow, on what the host city needs to follow. So you could spend X amount on facilities, X amount on infrastructure. Things that'll limit facility spending from getting out of control and unnecessary spending from having. So before that happens as well, I want a research study to be done that looks at the past events and games and where money was spent, how facilities were used. And also this research study will look at, what the city that's applying for it needs. So if they need better housing, they can budget for more housing. If they need better infrastructure, they can budget for better infrastructure. In the end, the research study they will propose that to the non-biased committee that can then, budget accordingly depending on what the research study found. So, in terms of hiring the right people to make the decisions, it just needs to be removing the local and national government from the picture. Obviously, their input's welcome, but agendas need to be sidelined. Things that could come up during re-election, all that needs to be sidelined. No, it needs to be a process done by a non-biased committee who can come up with long-term benefits for a country or a city and not be biased. That's the biggest thing, is to have a non-biased committee coming up with solutions for a country. And I think the most important thing that needs to be done is the research study. But in order to put that plan in action, the budgeting guideline needs to be set forth. And obviously you want to do a feasibility study on the city and making sure that it's suitable. But there needs to be a cap as well. There needs to be a cap on different things you can spend on. A cap on facilities, that's my main thing. And a maximum budget should also be established. Also, things like building an 18,000 or an 80,000 seat stadium in a city that only has 50,000 people, things like that need to be cut out as well. But as I've kind of outlined in this presentation, the disciplines of economics and political science can couple together to create a solution where a country or a city can truly benefit from hosting a major sporting event. So with my solution that's geared towards long-term growth and improvement of a community, hosts of these mega events can expect to see their money spent adequately. By using the technique I suggested, a non-biased committee, removing the local and national government, creating a budget guideline, and following that, I believe that countries can experience greater benefits and an improvement in quality of life and a lasting impact from these facilities. So thank you guys so much for watching my presentation. I really appreciate your time, and thanks a lot.